Hello, my name's Jeff Harrison, and thank you for joining me today. For this week's presentation in CNT 6418, I'd like to talk about forensic acquisition, and my particular topic will be forensic imaging of iOS devices, meaning mobile devices, iPads, iWatches, even Apple TVs could apply in certain scenarios. All right. So it's spring 2017 UCF for Professor Rick Leininger. So let's go ahead and jump in here. Acquisition of iOS devices. So first off, what do we mean by iOS devices? Well, that could include iPhones, of course, right? They're more popular than ever. iPads, iTouch devices, Apple Watches, maybe even Apple TVs, right? So the iOS device itself, right? Majority of them are based on the HFSX file system, and it's my understanding, I believe that's recently changed with the latest version of iOS 10, that they've made some more file system changes. It's based on flash memory, meaning there's no SD type card or micro SD type cards to analyze. It's all built-in flash memory, and lots of the data on the iOS devices is actually stored in SQLite databases. So we'll jump in and I'll show a few examples in a demo coming up. First things first, there's typically maybe 3 to 4 different ways you can acquire data from an iPhone. The first would be a physical, and that's more of a bit-by-bit stream copy like you would do on a PC if you were doing a forensic acquisition of a desktop or laptop device. And as we'll see later, it's actually gotten harder and harder to physically image a phone due to some of the security enhancements that Apple's made to the device. The next method is the logical acquisition, and that's more of a, think of it as maybe a file system backup. It grabs the majority of the file systems that they can, the forensic programs can acquire. And some of these are actually utilizing, or they're piggybacking off of the iTunes backup service to pull a backup of the device. So in some ways, they're not really developing. They develop their own software to parse the data, I would say. But some of the tools out there today don't seem like they develop their own methods to acquire the device. It's still a pretty locked and hardened device, so they're having to leverage any way they can access it. And then I'll call it a third and fourth method. It is maybe not acquiring device. Maybe the device was destroyed, but there's other ways you can still get data from that device, right, without doing a full chip-off acquisition. There's iCloud backups, first of all, right, and that's typically turned on by default on devices. You get 5 gigs of storage to store data in their cloud. The fourth method would be an actual iTunes backup. So if you've got a suspect, and they used a particular PC, laptop, desktop, you may be able to acquire a backup off of that device. It's not something you would normally think of, but that's another method. And I'll pull up an example here, but we just briefly mentioned the iTunes backups, right? So whenever you plug an iOS device in, you would typically see, let me see if I can pull it up for you here. You would typically see here, let me minimize it here. You would typically see where you can back up the machine, the phone itself to iCloud or to the backup. You've got an option to encrypt the backup also. This password is sometimes needed, and there's actually tools you can use to crack that if it's a simple or a 4-digit PIN or a simple passcode. You can actually crack the backup passwords. On the particular iTunes devices, there's also what they call a pairing or lockdown file. So the first time you plug your phone into the machine, it actually asks if you want to trust this machine, right? If you trust that computer. You may just want to plug your phone in to charge it, and you may not trust it, so you would click no. But if it's your home machine, you typically hit trust, and then you may sync it with iTunes to put some music on it, maybe an audio book or books or whatever you're syncing with your phone. When you do that, it creates what they call a pairing file, and Actually, give me just a second and I'll pull one up for you and show you an example of what my pairing file looks like. Okay, so sorry, I had to pause there for a second to find the folder. Basically on a machine, once you click trust on the phone's device, see if I can drag this into the window. In this particular folder here, C program files, Apple lockdown, and that's the case I believe on Windows Vista, Windows 8, and Windows 10. It's actually in a different location if you're on Windows 7. It creates this particular plist file, and I believe we can open this with a notepad. It creates this file. This has got the certificate information for the phone, and that it was backed up, and that your computer actually trusts it. So it looks like we've got a certificate in here. It's also got the MAC address for the device down here, and this is unique per device. Let me close that down. So that would technically allow you to pull a backup, or maybe you've got a locked phone. You've got access to the suspect's computer. You can't recover the password. If you've got that trust file or the lockdown file, you could potentially copy that over to a second machine and maybe force the phone to sync. Also, on if the computer's got iTunes installed, under this location here, users/username, app data, roaming, Apple computer, mobile sync, you've got backups for mobile devices that you sync with iTunes. So that's pretty much the fourth method to recover. And earlier I mentioned you could actually use an iCloud backup, right? So there's actually tools. This one's by Elcomsoft. This one will do a few things. It'll help you crack an iTunes backup. So if you've got a password on there, you can do a dictionary or a brute force attack. It's actually a fairly flexible tool. You can decrypt the iTunes backup if you don't know the password. You can also now built into the tool, you can get a backup from iCloud. So if you had the person's iTunes credentials, you could actually log into the cloud, pull down a cloud from the backup, as if you were the user, and retrieve that backup and decrypt it. And that's all built into that tool. And it's actually a fairly reasonable tool. It's fairly cheap compared to some of the other tools. And this is an awesome chart here I like to look at, and it's a good reference. But when you go to acquire an iOS device, depending on what type of device it is and what generation, that'll dictate what method you need to use, right, or what methods are possible. And I'll give you an example here. Let's look at the iCloud backup is the black cloud, right? So it looks like that was an option on iTunes iOS 7 and up. So if you've got an older iPhone 4, the iCloud option is not available. But there's options that are. The physical acquisition, I think, is probably one of the biggest ones, where starting with the iPhone 4S, right, they rolled out a new chip, and I believe that's when they enabled 64-bit. Some of the previous methods you use to unlock a locked device are you can no longer do it, right? They haven't found a way around that. Also, they created the secure enclave. I believe that was in iOS 7, and that made it harder to get to some of the storage because there's a certificate involved in it, encrypts some of the data on the phone, and even if you can physically image it, the data is still encrypted, so it doesn't do you any good. In here, you see one of the options here, iCloud backup may contain snapshots. That's actually available to law enforcement typically only, but there are tools available now that you could install locally if you had the user's credentials. You could pull that if you're legally allowed to. Also, if you look at the Apple here, this was an option up until iOS 7. Beginning with iOS 8, right, the secure enclave was enabled, and now supposedly Apple can no longer even help law enforcement, right, without creating an unlocked version of the bootloader or an unsigned version of the bootloader. They're not able to actually help out in that situation also. So basically, I guess to summarize there, the newer the device and the newer the iOS, typically the harder it is to get into the device, right? That's why when we'll look later here, I'll show a couple demos. Today, you can only do a physical acquisition of a device. If you know the unlock code, right, to get into the device, and it's jailbroken. And jailbreaking, right, of course, modifies devices on the files, and it may, it may jeopardize whatever evidence you want to introduce into court. Speaking of jailbroken, on the next slide here, and if you actually want to determine if the device was jailbroken, in the this is actually in the FS tab file. If you look before and after the jailbreak, this is what the file system, when it mounts it, what it looks like. And if you notice up here, the first partition there is read-only. After you jailbreak it, it actually shows read-write. So this is a telltale hint when you're inspecting a device on whether it's been jailbroken. Now, it's my understanding, right, they've made some newer changes to the latest version of iOS, and this file you can no longer see or even get to as an examiner. So you've got to look for other hints. Maybe looking for the Cydia App Store, looking for a config file where the phone may be pointing to the App Store in a certain scenario. And later on here, I'll do a quick demo of, I believe I've got an iOS 4 device, or I'm sorry, an iPhone 4, which is here. And this chart doesn't show it, but we can actually do a physical acquisition, and it doesn't have file level encryption enabled on the device, so it's a lot easier to get into. And then if we have time here, we're already at 11 minutes. I'll jump down into the file system, and we'll show you some of the common storage locations where SMS messages are stored, call history, call logs, calendar information, that kind of stuff. So let me jump in here and let's see if I can shrink this window here. The one thing you'll find with different mobile tools here, and this is actually Cellebrite's physical analyzer. Cellebrite was in the news, right, with the terrorism investigation in San Diego, where the FBI wanted Apple to create a special OS so they could unlock devices. So let's jump in here. So this is a summary here. It shows you quite a bit of information. But what I've learned is you can't rely on one tool to do your investigation. You've really got to use a combination of tools, really, because there's not one tool out there that shows everything. But this is I believe this was a 16 gig iPhone. Somewhere in here it tells me, yes, this is running iOS 6.1, and somewhere in here we'll see what version of the iPhone it was. User's name was Brian Carrier. This was an image I think Brian Carrier made. Celebrate. So let's jump in here. We can look at see what apps were installed on the phone. This is some of the default stuff: mobile device, mobile mail, calendar. We get down to the bottom here. We can see the user installed Google Maps, a program called KickChat, and this Words with Friends. We can go through and view calendar entries, right? These were different calendars on certain dates. It's a little bit harder to see there because I've shrunk this window. But here's a calendar on a certain date that was created an entry. Call log, right? This may, maybe you're doing an investigation and you want to see if a suspect had any kind of communications with somebody. Here's the to and from call log, the date and timestamp. Country code and network code, that's irrelevant for the most part. We can even see who they FaceTime, right? This was a FaceTime. Here was the duration, 12 seconds. This is just a test device, right? So this isn't real world data, but or it is, but it was just done for testing purposes. Here was a bunch of calls made and the duration of them. You can see there was a 12-minute call. Maybe if you're looking for certain words, you could go in there and do a search and see maybe there's a terrorism case, and you can look up certain things, right? Look for keywords. SMS messages. This is cell tower. This is interesting, right? This could technically show you where the user was, right? What area they were near. And this is a list of towers that the phone talked to that was connected to at a certain point, right? Here's GPS coordinates. There's actually some plugins here. I don't know if this one has it enabled, but there's actually plugins where you can map this GPS coordinates and overlay them onto like Google Maps, and it'll basically draw you a picture of where the user was. Now, you can't just rely on that as the only proof of evidence, but it may point you to other things or lead you to certain time frames if you're looking for something deeper. Of course, I think there's over 1 million apps now in the iPhone store. So another thing that's critical, right, to investigating mobile devices is understanding what apps they have on there. And a suspect may have not have used Maybe they didn't use SMS messages because they know the government, right, or law enforcement has the ability to monitor that. Maybe they use WhatsApp or Signal or some other app that encrypts messages. So in some cases, right, maybe you're not able to do a wiretap to grab that communication while it's in transit, but if you can get the suspect's mobile phone, you could possibly grab it off the device, right? Because at some point, if it touches that device, there may be temporary files. It may be in a database as a deleted record, and you may be able to recover it some other way. So here were some phone numbers here. There's one for Brian Carrier, different people that were called from this phone. Here's your contact list, right, of who they had in their contact list, email addresses, cookies. So there's a huge amount of information in here. This was an MMS message, so if we look here, there was an attachment. And I don't know what that is. It looks like maybe it's a memory stick, a USB stick here that was sent in that picture. There's another device sent. You can sometimes recover passwords for certain apps. Most of the newer apps now prevent this. There's a Gmail account here, Death G Grip. So occasionally you'll find stuff in here. Here was another one for Apple Test Gmail. That's probably something fake there, but these, they're getting smarter and smarter, and they're not, the applications are put them in a different area, so it's not as easy to find. Here's a backup password, right? This is probably your iTunes backup password. They did quad 0. There's one for Basis. All right. If I remember correctly, I think Basis is one of the parent companies of Celebrite, if I remember correctly. User accounts, user dictionaries. User dictionary is interesting because as you type words or have autocorrect on, it may, it may tell you words that were commonly used here. Let's see if we can sort by frequency. So let's look here, something that was used 4 times maybe. So these words were used more common on the phone than the others. Here's a Harley, Toyota, duck, phone, sun. Wireless networks, right? This is what wireless networks the phone authenticated to. And somewhere in here we should see the SSID. There we go. There's your SSIDs for different phones, right? So your phone remembers all of those. And we'll connect to them automatically later on. All right, we're at 17 minutes here, so I'm running out of time here. But let's jump in. So I'm going to show you some database files. So earlier I said all the data stored in SQLite databases. Let me see if I can find you a good database to try this on. So I'm going to open up the file system, data, and I believe it's under mobile or applications. So here's some different apps that were installed on the device. Library, here we go, accounts. So let's look at maybe calendar. Here's a SQLite database for the calendar, right? And you've got the different tables. So you could actually go back. Let's see if we've got anything under SMS. We should have something under here. Here's your SMS database, right? So it's pretty easy to figure this out. You figure out what the maybe what the user's name was, what the message was, and here's a may have to shut off the phone. Here's some different messages that were sent via SMS. And depending on what type of backup you get, you may or may not get deleted messages, right? Because if they're allocated, but or they're in unallocated space. But if you can get the access to the SQLite databases, you may see some of the deleted data in there, right, if it hasn't purged it out. But here's the different phone numbers, the different IDs that were pinged. So you can actually get quite a bit of information, right? It's just like a computer if you know where to look and you know how to parse the data. So that was Celebrite. Let me jump over to one other quick tool here and show you some of the other stuff available. And this is called Internet Evidence Finder. And this is good once you get a backup. It'll just dig through it and look for different connections. Maybe it'll look for emails, text documents of different stuff. So here were some different apps it found, right? It found Facebook on the phone, and it showed you what pages they were looking at on Facebook. Different contacts here. I don't know if there's any information in there. No, not it. It won't parse everything, right? Just like I said, there's not one tool. Here's one. The name was Kimberly. Here were Tinder. So on this date, it looks like this person browsed Tinder and was looking at people's profiles on Tinder, right? They sent messages on Tinder. Here, you can look up all this information, right? And here were some photos. This is probably a cache of the photos where they were browsing somebody's profile. Carved videos from the phone, right? You should be able to, some of these you can actually play if you double click on them. It'll open in a viewer and You could actually play the video. I'm running out of time here. Pictures from the phone. Here's different devices. iOS snapshot. So one of the things that iPhone does is when you do certain things or click the home button, in some cases it actually takes a snapshot of whatever was on the screen, which is interesting. So even though the user didn't intentionally save something, there may be a screenshot of something they were doing on the phone. Here's one from, this looks like it's from Facebook, right? There was somebody's profile they were viewing there. Here's your app history from Safari, all the web pages they browse, the cache from the device. Another good tool is called Oxygen Forensic Analyst. And let me move this to the window here. Let me shrink this so you can see it. And this one's got a really nice interface. It shows you all kinds of information. Here's the phone. It was an iPhone 4 running 613. Go back here. Here's contacts the person made, right? It shows you in a nice format. Phone book. You could look up somebody's information. It's actually got a search box over here so you could search, and it would search across all these different apps. One of the nice things that Oxygen does is it will parse through different applications. So let's see, here's Google Maps, right? So we could actually search for, here's what the person searched for in Google Maps. Here was a location they were at on a map. And here you go, look right here. Where was this person? This was out of Washington, D.C., right up near Tyson's Corner. So if you had a list of coordinates from their phone, the cell towers, you could actually overlay those on a map, which is pretty nice. But it's pretty powerful, and it's becoming really more and more needed, right, as people turn to mobile devices and they're using business. So that's just a brief overview, briefly scratching the surface, right? Of course, mobile devices every year, right? Apple rolls out a new phone, right? Pretty much every year they've rolled out a new iOS, right? We're at 10 already. So it's an ever-changing field. Celebrite, Oxygen, and Magnet Forensics are probably three of the most popular tools I've used. There's also some limited capabilities, I would say, with I think InCase will do some stuff, but it's, from what I've seen or used myself, it's fairly limited. Thank you for watching, and if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Let me jump back here. Here was a reference, right, I found for some of my information. This is a great blog here, digitalforensics.sans.com. That's where I took some mobile device training a few years ago and got certified on mobile device forensics. LComsoft, of course, makes some of the cracking tools you can use to decrypt backups. Smarter Forensics, another blog. There's some good write-ups there on the FBI case against the terrorist in San Bernardino. Thank you for joining. Have a nice day.